Hi, it's Katrina. The Vatican Necropolis. Hiding underneath what is arguably the most famous basilica in the world is a genuine city of the dead. This ghoulish necropolis is located directly underneath Vatican City's St. Peter's Basilica. Above ground is a world of wonder, a structure filled with beautiful artwork, fascinating frescoes, and hundreds of years of history. But 5 stories beneath it, hidden down in the darkness underground, is a ruin that dates back to the original founding of the Roman Empire. The altar at St. Peter's is at the apex of all of this history. The altar is stacked upon 2,000 years of bones, with the bodies of the dead hidden way underneath it. Many of the bodies buried underneath the basilica aren't even from Christians or Catholics. The oldest burial ground dates back to the 1st century AD and was used for pagans. Above that is yet another level of burials from the 5th century. This one is a bit more interesting because it's a mix of both pagans and Christians, a mausoleum from a time when the pagans of Europe were slowly converting to Catholicism. These 2 levels alone account for roughly 90% of the time the Roman Empire was in power, between the years 27 BC and 476 AD. Even though St. Peter's Basilica is what everyone knows and what the hill is famous for, it was a sacred place for a very long time. In another surprising twist, there is a hidden church buried underneath the floor of the basilica, and above that a more recent church from the 12th century. St. Peter's Basilica is really just the newest addition here, built over so much older history. The death of Pope John Paul I. In September 1978, Pope John Paul I died suddenly and without warning. His death came just 33 days after he was elected to the station of the Holy See. What was unusual at the time was that contradictory reports came out regarding the circumstances of his unexpected demise. Apparently, there had been anomalies with the death certificate, and to this day, nobody is entirely sure what happened to one of the shortest-lived popes in the Church's history. What we do have are a lot of conspiracy theories, any of which could be the actual truth. The only problem is that we don't have enough evidence to say which one is correct. There is a theory regarding the Vatican Bank, and that those in charge of that particular wing of the Vatican were wildly corrupt and worried that Pope John Paul I was going to bring the hammer down. They allegedly murdered him to keep their finances safe. The corruption is real and documented. We know that the head of the Vatican's Institute for Works of Religion, one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world, was up to his neck in corruption. His name was Bishop Paul Marcinkus, and he was indicted in 1982 for being an accessory to the collapse of Banco Ambrosiano and losing roughly $3.5 billion. We also know that one of the bishop's accomplices was a man named Roberto Calvi, who was a member of the illegal Italian Masonic Lodge. He was found dead in London in 1982, just weeks before his corruption went public. His death was ruled as self-inflicted, but there are plenty of conspiracy theories around that as well. The takeaway here is that looking at the Pope's death from an outside angle, it really seems that the Pope was killed to protect the bank. But in the end, the scandal was just too big to hide. The Vatican Obelisk. Located in the very center of St. Peter's Square in Vatican City is an ancient monument called the Vatican Obelisk. Most people wouldn't be able to tell you what it is, but pretty much everyone would recognize it if they saw a picture of the square. It's the massive pillar right in the very center of the plaza that looks like a giant Egyptian obelisk from thousands of years ago. This monument is thousands of years old, and it is actually Egyptian. The obelisk was stolen from the Egyptian city of Heliopolis during the brutal reign of one of the most infamous Roman emperors in history, Caligula. But the history behind the obelisk is even more sinister than that. After the Romans built a specially designed ship to transport the obelisk from Egypt to Rome, it was used for the execution of Christians. The pillar stood in the circus of Gaius and Nero during the time that St. Peter was crucified. Romans would bring Christians to the base of this very structure and then brutally execute them. After the circus was abandoned, Vatican Hill became a necropolis. And in the Middle Ages, the obelisk was still standing in the same place, with the blood of Christians splattered around its base. It was only in 1586 that the monument was finally moved from its original position and placed in the center of the piazza. St. Peter's Bones. A decade ago, the Vatican put on display for the first time in history the box which they believed to contain the ancient bones of Saint Peter, the Apostle and the first Bishop of Rome. It was Pope Francis's doing, the 266th Bishop of Rome. This was an extremely big deal at the time because prior to 2013, no pope in history had ever said definitively that the 8 pieces of bone hidden underneath St. Peter's Basilica were indeed those of St. Peter himself. The bones weren't even discovered until 1939, deep inside the grottos beneath the basilica, which is basically a 5-story labyrinth of 2,000 years of history. All these years later, there is still no definitive way to say if these bones ever belonged to the Apostle Peter. In 1968, Pope Paul VI simply said the connection was convincing, but couldn't give any actual evidence to back up the claim. And in 2013, the Vatican threw all discretion out the window and decided to just run with it. But honestly, we don't know whose bones they have in that old chest. Author Bruno Bartolini, who wrote The Ears of the Vatican, said that no pope ever allowed any scientist to study the bones, probably because they don't want to know, and also because there are documents hidden in the Vatican that say there is a 1,000-year-old curse on the tomb of St. Peter. Anyone who opens it will suffer from the worst possible misfortune. The Pope prisoners. For about 60 years, not a single pope left Vatican City. It was one of the weirdest times in the Vatican's history, which saw each pope become a prisoner of their own little kingdom. It had been a long time in the making, and it finally came into effect on May 13, 1871. The Italian Law of Guarantees was the Kingdom of Italy's attempt at solving their pope problem. They hated that the pope had so much influence and power over the people, and so the law was aimed at forcing the Holy See to be an ordinary subject of Italy and not a sovereign. They promised to treat the pope with similar honors that they would give to a king, but he was to be under strict Italian law. In response, 5 popes locked themselves inside the Palace of the Vatican and didn't leave, starting with Pope Pius IX, who died in 1878. The Pope was so furious that he excommunicated the King of Italy, basically sentencing him to a lifetime in hell. It ended with Pope Pius XI, who eventually worked out a new deal with Benito Mussolini in 1929. They decided that Vatican City would be its very own country, which it still is today. The Black Magic Grimoire. The Black Magic Grimoire is exactly what it sounds like. It's an ancient book of black magic that's been dated back anywhere from 1421 to 1521. However, no historian has ever agreed on when the first edition was published. Expert Owen Davies says it was 1702 when the first edition was made available, but other, more mainstream scholars suggest it was written in the 19th century as a kind of hoax. Anything we know about the Black Magic Grimoire, also known as the Grand Grimoire, is vague at best. The introductory chapter was likely written by a man named Antonio Veneciana del Rabina, and he got much of his information from the original writings of the great King Solomon. Many of the black magic spells in the book are variations of the Key of Solomon or the Red Dragon. So what does a book on black magic have to do with the Vatican? Rumor has it that an original copy is secured somewhere inside their archives. We don't know if any of it is true, but that's what some sources say. And considering the Vatican archives are home to pretty much every relevant religious text in the world, it wouldn't be a big surprise. It makes sense that they would keep a secret book hidden that can supposedly summon Lucifer and give one the ability to make a deal with the devil. Jesus' death certificate. The Shroud of Turin is a small piece of linen cloth that appears to show the imprint of the face of Jesus Christ. It looks kind of like a negative from a roll of film. Religious scholars believe the shroud was wrapped around the body of Christ after his death, which is why his face was left imprinted on it. The shroud was first mentioned in 1354 and quickly became one of the most legendary religious artifacts in the world. It was kept inside the royal chapel at the Cathedral of Turin in northern Italy ever since 1578. But the truth of the shroud is quite controversial. In 1988, tests proved it came from the Middle Ages, about 1,200 years after Christ's recorded death. But recently, Barbara Frail, a researcher with the Vatican's secret archives, says that traces of writing were found on the shroud, which has turned it into a kind of death certificate. Barbara says the fragments of words discovered on the shroud were written in Greek, Hebrew, and Latin, and say something like, "This shroud was placed over Jesus of Nazareth." This is information coming straight from somebody who works in the Vatican. It's now believed that this mysterious piece of linen was used by a clerk following Jesus' execution. His name was written on it in many different languages, then laid around his body before he was buried. Either it's real, and this really is Jesus Christ's actual death certificate, a legitimate document of death, or the Vatican is just telling stories. What do you think? The Pope escape tunnels. The Passetto di Borgo looks like any other old stone fortification in Vatican City. It runs 2,600 feet straight from the city to the Castel Sant'Angelo, and most people don't know what in the world it even is. This stone fortification was once a secret passageway used for popes to escape from harm. The passage, which from the outside honestly just looks like an ordinary wall, was constructed starting in 850 AD at the behest of Pope Nicholas III, but it wasn't finished for roughly 650 years until the reign of Pope Alexander VI in 1492. He was famous for corruption and nepotism, using his position and money to take care of his illegitimate children. Anyway, he finished the passageway just in time. Pope Alexander used his newly completed escape tunnel to escape when the French invaded 2 years later. All that effort really didn't amount to much, with only a handful of popes ever needing it. The last flight was in 1527, when Pope Clement VII had to escape the mutinous troops from the Holy Roman Emperor's imperial army. The troops had turned against Charles V and marched on Rome, and Clement VII was one of the few high-level people to escape, all thanks to his sneaky tunnel. In 2000, as a way to honor the Roman Catholic Church's Great Jubilee year, the Passetto was refurbished. In recent years, the church has opened the tunnels to visitors for a restricted amount of time during each summer. Lucifer. There are some who say that hidden in the bowels of the Vatican is proof that the devil exists. These are the same people who believe the Vatican is holding evidence of extraterrestrials. And in another puzzling conspiracy theory, there are people out there who believe the entire Catholic Church, all of Vatican City, and the Pope himself are controlled by Lucifer, all of them puppets of the devil. But this is all just wild conspiracy theory speculation. It's true that we don't know if the devil exists. The only church that has a devil inside of it is the Holy Trinity Church in Westminster. The church was built specifically to celebrate the defeat of Napoleon. Lucifer's portrayal lives inside this church in the United Kingdom, but it's not what you think. The devil was put here by a local artist, a man named Paul Fryer, who created a grotesque statue of Lucifer in wax with wings made of actual feathers caught up in power cables. It's one of the creepiest things in any church, especially one that's been in use for over a century, although it hasn't been used as a place of worship since the 1930s. But of course, it's just an artist's disturbing work, not proof that the devil is running the Vatican. The Resurrection. Speaking of creepy sculptures, there is an extremely disturbing sculpture that's actually inside the Vatican. It's called the Resurrection, and it was modeled in 1977 out of bronze and copper by an artist named Pericle Fazzini. It's about 66 feet long and 23 feet tall, and is the current backdrop for the stage in the Vatican's Paul VI Audience Hall. The Audience Hall is the source of quite a few conspiracy theories, almost all of them caused by the oddly horrific sculpture rising above the head of the frail old Pope. Even though the sculpture is meant to depict the resurrection of Christ, it looks like a bunch of melted snakes all tied together, with some kind of demon rising from a reactive black goo. Mr. Fazzini must have gotten his inspiration from some horror movie. The hall itself is where the Pope holds all his weekly meetings when the weather isn't good enough to be in St. Peter's Square. The sculpture, believe it or not, is actually supposed to instill a kind of shock in people when they see it for the first time. It has a prominent place in the hall because the sculptor wanted to remind all the Pope's audience that, as Christians, they shouldn't be afraid of what's to come when Jesus Christ is resurrected. Instead, they should accept the great cataclysm that will be upon them and rejoice in the resurrection, even if the world is thrown into a horrifying maelstrom of chaos and death. Gospel of Jesus' Wife. Researchers at Columbia University may have just proved that the Gospel of Jesus' Wife is a very real document, and not, as previously believed, a forgery. Before, religious experts decried the ancient piece of Coptic text as nothing but a hoax. However, scientists now believe it to be real, a fully authentic scrap of papyrus that confirms Jesus did indeed have a wife. This ancient text has been the subject of major controversy and scrutiny. It all started in 2011, when it was given to Harvard professor Karen King by an anonymous donor. The fragment dates back to the 8th century in Egypt, which has been confirmed by radiocarbon dating and tests on the chemical composition of the ink. What exactly does the papyrus say? It's not actually a piece from the Bible, and it's not gospel. It's just a loose scrap of ancient paper that contains the words, "Jesus said to them, 'My wife.'" This statement obviously suggests that Jesus was married, and to make matters even more interesting, the only legible name on the fragment is Mary. It doesn't say Magdalene, but it's hard to imagine any other Mary that could have been his wife. At the end of the day, religious organizations across the world still deny through their teeth that Jesus was married. But according to this mysterious text written by Egyptian Christians around 1,200 years ago, he could have very well been the husband to none other than Mary Magdalene herself. Saint Cuthbert Gospel. The Saint Cuthbert Gospel is an ancient religious text and is in fact the oldest surviving intact European book there is. It was written in the early 8th century and contains a Latin copy of the Gospel of John. There are obviously other ancient European books that have survived the centuries, but this one still has its original binding and looks as if it were printed yesterday. But who was Saint Cuthbert? He was apparently a monk who died in 687 AD and was buried on the sacred island of Lindisfarne off the coast of northern England. Legend has it that he rose to become a saint after his death, but his coffin was moved from its original place on the island during a Viking raid in the 9th century. The coffin was then discovered about 300 years later in Durham, where it was opened. Within the coffin was discovered this exact book, the Saint Cuthbert Gospel. One of the traditions of the Roman Catholic Church is that certain individuals and objects cannot be harmed by the ravages of time because of their holiness. This book is one of those things, believed to be incorruptible because it was buried with a saint. This is despite the fact that Cuthbert himself was now nothing but a skeleton. Scientists, on the other hand, don't believe in incorruptibility. They think the gospel was most likely worn around the neck of somebody in a leather pouch as a protective talisman. It could have been used to ward off evil spirits and was later slipped into the coffin to protect the saint's body. As for how it remained in such perfect condition, nobody's entirely sure. The Book of Sirach. The Book of Sirach is one of the actual forbidden books of the Bible. It was originally written in Hebrew and doesn't contain any major religious scripture, which might be why it wasn't included in the New Testament Bible. Instead, the book contains a number of ethical teachings. It was considered a book of wisdom, which a person could read to better their life and to enlighten themselves. It was almost like a self-help book, except that it was written around the year 175 BC by Ben Sira, a Judahite scribe living in Israel. This book is the largest book of wisdom from antiquity that survived into the modern era. It's accepted by Catholics and Eastern Orthodox as part of their biblical canon. However, Anglican Christians believe it's nothing but an instruction on manners and has nothing to do with God, and the same can be said of the Lutheran Church. What's written in the book is pretty fascinating. It begins with a series of 6 poems discussing the attainment of wisdom. From there, the book becomes divided into chapters that don't appear to correlate with each other at all, except for the first 2. The first couple of chapters can almost be described as theological ramblings about fearing God and obtaining wisdom. Next comes a dramatic praise of God's glory, and later a celebration of the heroes of ancient Israel, which date back to before the Great Flood. The Moabite Stone. The Moabite Stone was discovered at Dibon, Jordan in 1868 by a missionary named F.A. Klein. It's an ancient proclamation stone with an inscription from the king of Moab, and it's also the longest Iron Age inscription that's ever been found in the region. What's truly fascinating about the stone is that it parallels an episode in the Bible's Book of Kings, yet it tells the same story in a very different way. Historically, Moab and Israel were 2 conflicting kingdoms in the 9th century BC. We know that they went to war, but we're not entirely sure why. In the Bible, Moab is depicted as a horrible place that rebelled against Israel, who were God's chosen people. And so Israel fought back to crush the idol-worshipping pagans. And yet the Moabite stone tells a different story. It was written by Mesha, king of Moab, and claims that Israel had invaded one of his cities, and they were trying to wipe out the Moabites. Because of this, Moab merely fought back against their oppressors. This is an incredible find because it shows two very different sides of something that happened nearly 3,000 years ago. The Israelites and Moabites did indeed go to war, so that much is true, but who holds the blame for the bloodshed is unknown. The Bible says that Israel was righteous in their fighting, but the Moabite stone says the Israelites were bloodthirsty conquerors who needed to be stopped. The Mummy Gospel. The oldest fragment of a New Testament gospel was recently discovered inside the mask of an Egyptian mummy. It's a piece of papyrus, upon which is written a small portion of the Gospel of Mark. A team of researchers led by Craig Evans from the Acadia Divinity College in Wolfville, Nova Scotia, analyzed the handwriting and carbon dated the fragment. From the tests, we now know it was written sometime before 90 AD, which would make it about 10 years older than any other piece of the New Testament ever discovered. It had been stashed inside of the mummy's cartonnage, or its burial mask. What's really interesting is that in ancient Egypt, mummies were buried with masks of all different kinds of material. The wealthy would have masks made of solid gold, whereas ordinary people would use scraps of linen or papyrus. When these masks were taken apart, all kinds of ancient documents could be unveiled. And this is where the Christian text came from. Although the Gospel of Mark is a fully canonical gospel and not a forbidden text of the Bible, the fact that it was stuffed into a dead Egyptian's face is fascinating. It was used like you might use an old newspaper to make paper mache. The Books of the Maccabees. There are in total 4 Maccabees. These books don't appear anywhere in the Hebrew Bible, and only 2 of them appear in the Septuagint, which was the earliest translation of the Old Testament made for Jewish people living in Egypt. Absolutely none of the original manuscripts that were written in Hebrew still survive, with only a handful of examples that were written in Greek still in existence. These books are a little different from other forbidden biblical texts because they don't really talk that much about God. The book's focus is on the history of the Maccabees, who were the leaders of the Jewish rebellion against the Seleucid dynasty of Macedonia following the death of Alexander the Great. The only church that accepts all 4 books of the Maccabees as canonical is the Georgian Orthodox Church. Only the first 2 books are labeled canonical by the Catholic Church, and the first 3 by the Eastern Orthodox Church. These are some of the least popular forbidden texts because the Maccabees primarily tell a historical account. The first 2 books discuss the Jewish rebellion from between 175 BC and 134 BC, and as the series goes on, the narrative seems to disintegrate into philosophical religious ramblings. The Gospel of the Lots of Mary. A professor of religion at Princeton University has discovered the Gospel of the Lots of Mary. This previously unknown gospel was found inside of a miniature Coptic codex. The small codex is a book from around the 5th or 6th century AD, a tiny thing only 3 inches in height. This ancient text was donated to Harvard University in 1984 by a woman named Beatrice Kalekian. Her late husband had been an influential trader of antiquities and had procured the book from an unknown source. Its authenticity is real, and the message inside of it is nothing short of extraordinary. 1,500 years ago, the book was used to look into the future. The opening statement for the book is the Gospel of the Lots of Mary, the mother of the Lord Jesus Christ, she to whom Gabriel the archangel brought the good news. He who will go forward with his whole heart will obtain what he seeks, only do not be of 2 minds. That's quite a starting line, but it gets even more interesting from there. The book is a collection of forbidden oracles. There are 37 predictions written extremely vague inside the book, with only a couple actually mentioning Jesus. According to the researcher who found it, the book would have been used for divination. If a person wanted to know the answer to something, they would simply select one of the oracles at random, and the way they interpreted the text would be their answer. It was almost like a magic 8-ball, one that people believed worked by God's will, and would lead them to a brighter tomorrow. The mysterious Lisborn Gospel. The Lisborn Gospel is one of the strangest and most valuable religious books on the planet. There are only 5 copies in existence, and one of them contains a hidden treasure. The book itself contains the 4 main Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But the Lisborn Gospel is special because it was handmade using carved oak and copper clasps in Germany. It was likely created on the orders of a high-born lady who entered a convent in Lisborn near the end of the 10th century. According to the Illuminated Gallery, a medieval manuscript dealer, the book is for sale at a price of about $6.5 million. Within the book is a mysterious prayer wheel that was likely added to the blank first page in the 12th century. The prayer wheel was written in medieval Latin and was likely used to help someone get through their prayers. Each circle of the wheel contains instructions, from the 7 petitions to gifts of the Holy Spirit. Somebody could read through the circles until they got to the very center, which contains just one word: God. As for why gospel books like these were so important in the Middle Ages, it has to do with the lingering pagan belief of sacred objects. Even though this was religious scripture, humans were still accustomed to items having magical properties. People believed that by carrying one of these gospel books around with them, they were literally carrying the physical embodiment of the Word of God. The Book of Judith. The Book of Judith is one of the forbidden books of the Bible and is one of the 14 main apocrypha of the Old Testament. While it is indeed part of the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Bibles, it's strictly excluded from the canon by Jews and Protestants. The story told in the book revolves around a woman named Judith. It discusses the final stages of the Assyrian siege of Bethulia and how Judith traveled to the enemy camp to seduce and interrogate General Holofernes. Once she gets him good and drunk, she chops off his head and takes it back to her thankful countrymen. Due to this heroic action, the Assyrians fled without a leader, and Israel was saved. Although Judith was wanted and courted by many men, she chose to remain unmarried for the rest of her life. What's quite interesting about Judith's story is that she resembles a lot of other biblical women. For example, her story is similar to that of Jael in the Book of Judges. Jael lures the enemy commander to her tent, where he falls asleep, and then she kills him. The only major difference is that Judith's book goes into vivid detail about the incoming battle, which would have seen Israel and Jerusalem destroyed by the mighty ruler of Assyria, Nebuchadnezzar. It's unclear how much of the story is true, although Judith has had a prominent place in religious artwork for the past 2,000 years. Mary Magdalene, first pope. Based on the final version of the Gospel of John, religious historians believe that Mary Magdalene was supposed to be the successor of Jesus. We know that Mary Magdalene was the principal disciple at the tomb where Jesus was resurrected, but there's always been a bit of ambiguity over what actually happened on Easter Day 2,000 years ago. When Mary Magdalene looked into the tomb, she witnessed 2 angels sitting where the body of Jesus had previously lain. However, when Peter looked into the tomb, he saw only linen clothing. The 2 separate viewpoints suggest that they had actually looked into 2 different rooms, and that Mary Magdalene was the one given a vision of the heavenly angels, not Peter. Because both these viewpoints were written in the Gospels, it would make sense that Mary Magdalene was actually the person chosen by God himself to build his church. However, it's extremely doubtful that the ruling men of the day wanted a woman to be the first pope. So, despite everything, they gave that job to Peter as Jesus' most trusted disciple. There are some people out there who actually take this piece of John's Gospel as evidence that the church as we know it is corrupted because the wrong person was chosen to become the high priest. It should have been Mary, but instead it was Peter, and the church has been a violent and scandalous entity ever since, devoid of any kind of godliness. Of course, that's up for you to decide. The Kotar. There is a demonic beast called the Kotar. It comes from Frankish mythology and was supposedly a beast of Neptune. The mysterious creature appeared in just one text, but it was believed to be the father of an entire bloodline of kings whose descendants are still living today. Here's how the story goes. The Franks were a Germanic tribe who migrated into France and became the Frankish people, and later the French. The ruling dynasty was the Merovingians, starting with King Merovech. This king was allegedly the offspring of a demon creature, one who impregnated Merovech's mother when she went swimming one day. The Kotar came up from the depths of the sea, procreated with the king's mom, and then swam away. Therefore, King Merovech and each of his descendants were directly connected to some bizarre mythical sea creature. Historical experts believe the legend started as an attempt to make the Frankish kings seem godlier than they really were. By saying the kings were the offspring of a demonic sea beast, each ruler was elevated to the status of demigod. The Codex Hias. The Codex Hias is a book with a picture of a strange green devil in it. It was discovered in 1648 during the final days of the 30 Years' War. The Swedish army moved into Prague, looted the city, and took home all the treasures they could find. One of the treasures they uncovered in the ancient city was a massive book called the Codex Hias, or the Devil's Bible. To this day, it is still the largest known medieval book in the world, and also one of the most bizarre. The Devil's Bible is a whopping 36 inches tall, 20 inches wide, and nearly 9 inches thick. And although it only contains 310 pages, those pages are made from pure vellum, meaning that it would have taken 160 donkeys to make. It weighs a total of 165 pounds. But just what in the world is inside of this incredible medieval manuscript? The answer is the entirety of the Christian Bible. It also contains an encyclopedia by Saint Isidore of Seville, the Chronicle of Bohemia, and 2 books on Jewish history written by Flavius Josephus 2,000 years ago in the 1st century. There are also smaller texts, brief excerpts about medical practices, and even how to perform an exorcism. But by far the strangest piece of the book is the huge, full-color painting of the devil. There is an entire page taken up by an oddly coherent portrait of the devil. He is 19 inches tall, naked except for a loincloth, and no one knows what the purpose behind the painting is. One of the myths is that the scribe who wrote the book sold his soul to the devil so that he could complete his masterpiece in one night. The Epilepsy Demon. The earliest image of a demon in all of history is currently housed in the archives of a museum in Berlin. The demon is drawn on an old tablet dating to be 2,670 years old. This was far before Christianity, long before modern depictions of the devil, and yet the ancient demon looks very similar to our modern vision of what a demon should look like. It has curved horns, a long tail, the tongue of a serpent, and what appear to be reptilian eyes. The demon was initially discovered by an expert in ancient Assyria at the University of Copenhagen named Dr. Charles Pank Arbel. He was examining the historical object when he realized there was an outline of a strange creature on it. When he understood he was staring at a goat demon, the rest of the tablet suddenly made perfect sense, because written on the ancient tablet is a cure for convulsions. The Assyrians described a horrible disease called Bennu, which caused involuntary twitching and spastic muscle movement. Most historians agree the Assyrian disease was in fact epilepsy. But for the Assyrians, when they saw somebody having violent seizures and suffering from other symptoms of epilepsy, they thought the victim was possessed by demons. Pretty much any unusual illness was attributed to a demon, either that or the moon god Sin, who was often blamed for mental shortcomings and insane behavior. This tablet shows the epilepsy demon that the Assyrians believed was responsible for all kinds of disabilities and infections. The only cure for epilepsy in Assyria nearly 3,000 years ago was to perform an exorcism. An exorcist would dress in a red cloak and try to drive the demon out with rituals involving thorn bushes, mice, and raven. Japanese demon stone. The demonic spirit of a beautiful woman who tried to kill the emperor 1,000 years ago was recently released from her eternal prison. According to local folklore in the small Japanese town of Nasu, the story of the demon woman goes back to the 10th century. She was an evil spirit named Tamamo no Mei, a fox with 9 tails who could take the form of any beautiful woman she wanted. She became wrapped up in a plot to overthrow Emperor Toba in the early 1100s. But a local warrior named Miura no Suke became aware of the plot, and he killed the demon before she could assassinate the emperor. After the demon was slain, her spirit became trapped inside of a chunk of stone. According to the myth, anyone who touches the stone dies. The stone became so famous that in 1957 it was turned into a national landmark. But in 2022, the stone shattered, allegedly releasing the spirit of the demon back into the world after 1,000 years in prison. Do you think the shattered stone could be a bad omen of things to come? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. The Demon Drummer. The story of John Mompesson and the Phantom Drummer goes back to April of 1661. In the quiet town of Tedworth, England, William Drury was apprehended by the authorities for practicing magic and having other shady dealings. William was a drummer, and the authorities took his drum away and forced him to leave town. When William begged for his instrument back, the authorities said no. Instead, they passed it on to the local magistrate, John Mompesson, as a gift. John didn't really care about the drum, but it looked good in his house, so he kept it there. But after a few days, strange things started to happen. There were other weird noises like banging from the roof and rapping on the furniture. But above it all was the low thrum of the beating drum all throughout the night. Even after John had William's drum destroyed, the noises continued. It was only after William was arrested and sent away to the colonies that the drum noises finally stopped in John's house. It seemed William had some kind of psychic tether to the drums, and only a massive distance could prevent him from haunting John's house. Because while William was away, the noises ceased. But when William returned to England, the connection was re-established, and the drumming began anew. John was tormented for about a year. His windows would shake. He had all the signs in his house of a demonic poltergeist. And then, suddenly, it was over. Nobody knows what happened to William Drury, but there's been a lot of speculation over the years that he was a living, breathing demon, and that after his drum was taken away, he haunted John Mompesson's home until he got bored. The Siberian Demon Idol. In 1894, a group of men hunting for gold near the Russian city of Yekaterinburg unearthed a peculiar wooden idol. This wooden idol was huge, a single piece of wood covered in strange drawings of human faces and hands, along with weird geometric patterns. The idol was an astounding 15 feet long. But because this was 1894, nobody had the technology to understand the significance of the discovery. The idol was placed in a museum and put on display as an oddity for over a century. In modern times, researchers have identified the idol as one of the oldest examples of monumental art. It's 11,600 years old, a statue carved from a massive larchwood log. It's called the Shigir idol, and some experts say it might just be the world's first statue of a demon. It's unbelievably old, and nobody knows who made it. Thomas Terberger, an archaeologist from the University of Göttingen, says it must have been hunter-gatherers who carved it, not any kind of farming society. The idol is so ancient that when it was first radiocarbon dated in the 1990s, scientists rejected the results as implausible. It wasn't until new testing was done in 2014 that scientists were finally forced to accept the dating as real. As for the bit about the demon, that's a little more complicated. Scholars have struggled to make sense of the idol, and no one seems to understand what it was made to represent. Mikhail Zelin from the Russian Academy of Sciences says it depicts an ancient demon. The zigzag pattern on the statue could have been a warning. The idol was most likely placed in front of a forbidden zone, acting as a warning not to enter. Egyptian demons. An Egyptologist based out of Belgium has just identified what appears to be the oldest depiction of a demon in Egyptian history. The mysterious Egyptian demon predates the Epilepsy Demon from Assyria. Wael Sherbini was the one who made the discovery. Wael came across the illustrations of two demons on coffins from the Middle Kingdom about 4,000 years ago. Wael also discovered a third depiction of a demon on a leather roll, which was found collecting dust on shelves at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Nobody knows where it came from, only that it had been sitting on the shelf for 70 years, forgotten and never catalogued. At 4,000 years old, it's one of the oldest and longest leather manuscripts ever found, and it has a frightening image of a demon on it. One of the demons found painted on the coffins is called Intep, and he was depicted as a weird dog-baboon hybrid. The other coffin demon is Cherry-Benut, who was shown as a humanoid figure. It's believed Intep was a demon of decapitation. He would have been summoned should any person attempt to break into the sacred burial chamber, and he would have cut their head off. At least this is what the Egyptians believed. Experts say these demons weren't evil in the traditional sense, and that they were often used as guardians for people's tombs. The demon possession of George Lucans. George Lucans was a tailor who became the unfortunate victim of a demonic possession a few centuries ago in 1788. It all started when a woman named Sarah Barber told her pastor that she had come across a man named George during her travels. George had a strange illness. He sang and screamed, was able to shout in voices not altogether human, and there was no doctor who could fix him. Sarah also informed her pastor that George was a man of extraordinarily wholesome character. He was a respected member of society and had never done anything strange in all his life. He received the sacraments and attended every worship, and yet it seemed that a demon had slipped into his body and was making him act erratically. This was the 18th century, and so there were more scientific means to deal with unusual conditions. George was admitted to the hospital and stayed there for 20 weeks, but he was eventually announced incurable. Members of his community began to say he was bewitched and that he had 7 demons inside of him. The only way to remove them would be with the help of 7 clergymen working in unison. On Friday the 13th, June 1778, 7 clergymen transferred George Lucans to the Temple Church and performed an exorcism. It was a long and horrible night, but in the end, the clergymen prevailed. They banished George's 7 demons back to hell, and George sat upright and shouted, "Blessed Jesus!" And from that point on, George was an ordinary man. The Persian Book of Demons. A mysterious book on magic and astrology was discovered in the Iranian city of Isfahan. The strange manuscript contains information on how to cast spells and interact with demons, as well as the instructions for rituals and how to deal with certain mythical creatures. The book also claims that its knowledge came from the biblical Solomon, who was known for possessing great power and ruling over demons and spirits alike. Within this manuscript are 56 painted illustrations. Most of them are strange and demonic beings from ancient Persia, demons with blue skin, sharp horns, loincloths, and bright red tongues. It shows demons visiting sleepers in their beds. There are even paintings of sinister entities in the act of pulling out teeth and gouging eyes. There is one weird painting of a reptilian cat demon with a tail of shark teeth licking a man's feet while he's asleep in bed. Polish demon burials. Researchers discovered some very strange burials in a graveyard in the town of Drawsko in Poland. These were demon burials, bodies put in the ground with sickles placed across their throats to keep them in the dirt. While there's been a lot of speculation over these bizarre graves since their discovery, mostly people calling them vampire graves, the truth is that they were more demonic than vampiric. That's what researcher Marek Polson from Lakehead University says. The act of placing a sickle over the throat of a dead person was common and pretty straightforward. It was done to prevent the soul of the demon-possessed body from rising back into the world of the living and threatening people. This was an extraordinarily common thing in Poland during the 17th century, the era in which these bodies were buried. It was a time of great social upheaval, unending wars, pestilence, and widespread famine. Everyone was sick, dying, and scared, and they told each other stories of devilry and witchcraft. Demons lived inside their imaginations. Anyone who wasn't a farmer, who didn't look the right way, or who didn't speak with the local dialect could be considered a demon. The War on Cats. Pope Gregory IX ruled the Catholic Church between 1227 and 1241. It was a time of great paranoia. Europe was gripped by a fear of death, a fear of going to hell, and the fear that Satan was around every corner. When Pope Gregory announced to the world that cats were carriers for the spirit of the devil, he initiated a war on cats that would almost wipe felines off the face of the planet. Between approximately 1233 and 1234, cat fever gripped Europe. Those loyal to the church under direct orders of the Pope exterminated an impossible number of cats, and they were hunted down. Hysteria gripped England and mainland Europe alike, with many people believing cats were magical familiars of witches, their magical pets. The mad rush to murder cats ended only when the Pope finally excommunicated cats. People still hunted them here and there, and they remained hated for centuries to follow, but the main massacre ended. Shortly after, when the Black Plague showed up in Europe, it managed to kill almost half the human population because there weren't enough cats to fight off the swarms of plague-carrying rats. William Tyndale. William Tyndale was an English scholar, priest, and enemy of the church. He was a talented English linguistics expert who made it his business to translate the Bible into English for the first time. Sadly for William, he was killed for it. The thing the Catholic Church doesn't want you to know is that up until William came along, they didn't want anyone to read the Bible. They controlled Scripture with an iron fist, and always had. The original Bible appeared near the end of the 4th century AD, and was later translated into Latin by Saint Jerome. The Church considered the Latin Vulgate Bible to be the one and only version, and expressly forbade any translation into any other country's national language, not just English. As you know, the Bible is a complex book. It is not a clear manual, but it is full of things that can be misinterpreted or confusing. So, by controlling the language of the Bible, the Church could be the sole interpreter of the Bible and keep the people close. Contradictory interpretations of the Bible could lead to conflict, and eventually did, resulting in over 300 different Christian denominations. It was better for the Church to keep a tight grip on the Word of God. In the 1500s, William Tyndale first asked for permission in England, but was denied. He had originally wanted to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. When he was told not to do it, William translated and published the New Testament into English, and then smuggled the books into England. He believed that the Bible alone should determine the practice and doctrine of the Church, and all believers should be able to read the Bible in their own language. This was a big deal, because he had translated them straight from the Hebrew and Greek texts, not from the authorized Latin version. When the Church found out Tyndale was trying to make the Bible widely available for all people, they were furious. He fled to Germany to try to finish his translation of the New Testament and printed copies. He was captured later in Antwerp and condemned for heresy. In 1536, Tyndale was executed by strangulation and then burned at the stake. The Banquet of Chestnuts. The Banquet of Chestnuts was one of the most despicable parties ever thrown by the Church. We don't know for sure if this is a historical event, as the only mention of it is preserved in a Latin diary written by Johann Burchard, the master of ceremonies for the Vatican. Johann wrote in his diary that Cardinal Cesare Borgia, the son of Pope Alexander VI, held the Banquet of Chestnuts on October 31st, 1501. You know the Borgias and their crazy reputation. The banquet was held within the papal palace itself, at the center of Vatican City. It was one of the most sinful things that ever happened here. Although, maybe not. The reason the banquet is seen as such a horrific thing for the Church is that there were at least 50 ladies of the night in attendance, if you know what I mean. They were the entertainment for the guests of the banquet, most of whom were the highest members of the Vatican. The Pope's own son had 50 ladies dance for the dinner guests, take their clothes off, crawl around on the floor, which was covered in chestnuts for some reason. Not only were the most important people in the Church present, but so was the Pope and the Pope's own daughter. And here's where things get truly disturbing. The Pope handed out prizes for who could be intimate with the most ladies. For all intents and purposes, this was a Vatican orgy of devilish proportions. The most sinful party guests were given prizes like tunics made of silk, fancy shoes, and nice hats. Experts in the Church have denounced the diary as a fake. However, given the atrocious reputation of the Church in the Middle Ages and the Borgia, the banquet shouldn't come as a huge surprise. The Vatican's Hall of Shame. Pope Alexander VI was the man allegedly present during the Banquet of Chestnuts, but he was hardly the worst pope to have ruled the Papal States. The Vatican has a very special Hall of Shame, not an official one like the Hollywood Walk of Fame, but it exists in the records of history. The Vatican's Hall of Shame contains the names of some of the most disturbed, monstrous, and unholy popes that the Church desperately wants you to forget. Let's start with Pope Sergius III, who came into power in 904 after he murdered the pope before him. He became fascinated with a teenage prostitute named Marozia, who was 30 years younger than him, and they had a son together. That son would grow to be the next in line to rule. He was Pope Anastasius III, and he was yet another notoriously awful pope who sold positions in the church for cash to make himself rich. Between 955 and 964 was Pope John XII, a man accused of romancing both his sisters. He was killed at the young age of 27 when he got caught in bed with a married woman and was beaten to death with a hammer. That really doesn't sound like something that should be happening to the Pope. Pope Benedict IX, who ruled between 1032 and 1048, had a problem with young boys. St. Peter Damian once described him as a wretch who feasts on immortality, and also as a demon from hell in the disguise of a priest. The list goes on and on. Pope Boniface VIII was known for his affair with a married woman and her daughter. He was so openly deviant that Dante reserved a special place for him in the 8th circle of hell. So, what do you think about the crazy Pope stories? Do you think they are all true? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already for more crazy history. Indulgence. Indulgence was an old practice used by the Church to make money off the absolution of sin. The original idea behind an indulgence was that if a person committed such a terrible sin that it couldn't be forgiven through mere absolution, they would need to pay a penance. This penance would be paid in cash to the Church, so that God wouldn't be so angry with the sinner. Indulgence worked because medieval people were terrified of both hell and purgatory. They firmly believed that if their sins were not forgiven, they would wind up in limbo for the rest of existence. Starting in the 11th century, the idea of purgatory swept across Europe, and while popes were running amok and clergy were as corrupt as could be, those in power decided to start making money from fear. Bishops were given the authority to dispense indulgences for the right price. So this means that you could pay your local bishop to be absolved of doing something atrocious, like murder, or something maybe even worse. The Croatian Genocide. The Catholic Church openly supported a movement in World War II that would see one of the worst genocides in European history play out. This was the indiscriminate killing of Serbian, Jewish, and Roma people living in Yugoslavia. Catholic priests were willing accomplices from between 1941 and 1945, supporting the regime of Ante Pavelić in Croatia. Over 800,000 Yugoslavian citizens were killed, while the Church watched and did absolutely nothing. The full story of the Catholic Church and the genocide is wildly complex and goes back centuries. To make things digestible, we're going to start with the invasion of Yugoslavia and Greece by Nazi Germany in April of 1941. The Nazis exploited ethnic divisions already alive in Yugoslavia and tried to label themselves as the good guys to the Croats, the ethnic people of Croatia. The Nazis helped to set up the independent state of Croatia, which at the time seemed to the locals like a good thing. But when the deputy prime minister refused to help operate the puppet government, the Ustaše were put in charge. This was the fascist government of Croatia, with its origins going back to 1929. It was a puppet organization for Hitler to control. Once the puppet government was established, they began a ruthless campaign of persecution and murder of Serbians, Jewish people, and Gypsies. While this was happening, the Church was busy forcing conversions on everyone they could get their hands on, including the Jewish people who would otherwise be slaughtered. Archbishop Stepinac of Zagreb was 100% complicit in the genocide, which resulted in the horrific loss of almost 1 million lives. And at the same time, the Vatican and Pope Pius XII refused to act or speak out. In fact, the Pope refused to speak out about the Nazi atrocities, sitting back and watching as the Holocaust unfolded. Many have blamed the Church for supporting what they were hoping would be a new world order, with no more Jewish or Muslim people. The Magdalene Asylums. The Magdalene Asylums are a stain on the history of the Roman Catholic Church. The asylums were not designed to hold the mentally ill or criminally insane, but instead for women seen as unfit for society by the Church. Women who are accused of being promiscuous, young women who became pregnant outside of marriage, or any girl or teenager who did not have the support of her family. All of these young girls and women would be sent to the Magdalene Asylums. Once locked up in an asylum, they would be forced to work with no pay and given barely enough food to survive. They were like work camps that sprang up in World War II. The thing about the Magdalene Asylums, which were functional between the 18th and late 20th centuries, is that they were supposedly put together to treat and help women in need. Instead, the Church used them as free labor camps. These asylums were operational in the UK, Ireland, Canada, Australia, and the United States. The first one opened in England in 1758, and the last one didn't close until 1996. At the peak of the craze in 1900, there were about 300 asylums in England alone. John Hus. On the morning of July 6, 1415, John Hus was led from his prison at the cathedral in Constance to an elevated platform. He had just spent 219 days incarcerated in the most despicable of conditions. It was nice to get some fresh air and be out of his jail cell, but after he was forced to listen to a sermon, the fresh air wasn't so great anymore. He was stripped of his clothes, marched through the streets in front of the people, and then burned alive at the stake. But what did John Hus do to deserve such brutal punishment? John Hus was one of the first reformers of the Church and the inspiration for the Hussitism movement that came after his death. He would also grow to be one of the major inspirations for Martin Luther, who sparked Protestantism as a kind of evolution to Hussitism. John first earned himself a degree in art, then became an officially ordained priest. He began to preach in Prague, Hungary, and openly opposed certain aspects of the Catholic Church. He was very outspoken about things like selling church offices, and he was particularly harsh on the church and its corruption. Pope Alexander V was so annoyed that a man was in opposition of the church, even though that man was an ordained priest, that he had him excommunicated. However, Alexander never followed through on the excommunication. When anti-Pope John XXIII came into office in 1410 and the corruption got even worse, John summoned Jan to finally be excommunicated officially. John Hus was informed that when he arrived for the meeting he would be kicked out of the church, but nothing bad would happen to him. This was a lie. When he got there, he was dragged into prison, kept in a cell for over 200 days, and then burned alive for heresy. These are the kinds of cruel murders and trickeries that the church doesn't want you thinking about. An upsetting mummy. In 2017, a group of people from Sudan asked the Vatican to give back the mummy of a revered ancient princess. The mummy was stolen by the British during colonialism, then handed over to the Vatican, who have been keeping her prisoner in their museum ever since. The group, which doesn't have an official name, called on the Vatican to return the mummified remains of Princess Amenerdis, daughter of King Kashta and Queen Pebatjama of the Kushite Empire. She was born in the 25th dynasty of ancient Egypt, though she wasn't Egyptian. She originated from the kingdom of Kush, located in modern-day Sudan. She would grow to be a fierce woman, taking power in 714 BC and ruling over the kingdom as high priestess until 700 BC. She was also the sister of Pharaoh Shabaka and Pharaoh Piye. After the princess died, she was buried in a tomb in Medinet Habu, a marvelous archaeological site near the city of Luxor in Egypt. She was then pillaged by the British, and now the Vatican refuses to give her back to the Sudanese people, who want their princess resting where they say she belongs. The group says the princess isn't an object to be held in the museum of the church, but a person who should be back in her homeland. Sadly, this is just another case of the church holding onto items pillaged from other civilizations and refusing to give them back. What do you think? Should they return the mummy, or is it finders keepers? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Canada's Indigenous children. From 1883 to 1998, an estimated 150,000 Indigenous children were taken from their families. These children were kidnapped and forced to attend church-run boarding schools in a desperate attempt by the Canadian government and the Catholic Church to assimilate them into white society. It's a dark stain on both Canada's past and the Church's extremely recent past. A 2015 report from Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission called it a cultural genocide. During those 115 years of forced assimilation, an estimated 3,200 children died attending the residential schools and were then buried in unmarked graves. The return of the Nephilim. In the Book of Genesis, it describes how in the days before the flood, a group of giant beings called the Nephilim lived on Earth. It doesn't go into deep detail, but it does mention the Nephilim were the offspring of fallen angels and human women. In the Book of Enoch, a lot more details are given around the exact circumstances of the angel/human breeding situation. God initially sent the angels to watch over his newly created humans, but the angels soon became obsessed with human women. They defied God by having babies with these women, creating the giants called Nephilim. This lasted for many centuries. The Nephilim slowly began to take over the world. The fallen angels taught them all the forbidden magic and science that ordinary mortals were not supposed to know. God eventually became so disgusted by the sin on earth that he sent the flood to wipe out the Nephilim. When the flood waters receded, humanity restarted, and Noah's sons went forth to repopulate the world. There is absolutely no scientific evidence that any of this happened, but it's written in the Bible, and many people believe it to be true. There are some who believe the Nephilim didn't completely die. There is even a bizarre conspiracy theory which claims the Nephilim survived the catastrophe of the flood and bred with a second generation of human women. They grew smaller, more like ordinary humans, and are still supposedly among us right now. The meteorite throne. There could be a throne hiding in the Great Pyramid of Giza, one that's made from meteorites. The meteorite throne is said to be hiding in a mysterious void over 90 feet long that was discovered inside the pyramid. Archaeologists say it could have been built to help an unknown pharaoh pass into the next life. The throne has not been physically discovered, but we do have ancient texts that mention it. One of these texts, analyzed by researchers, claims the pharaoh will, before reaching the stars of the north, pass the gate in the sky and sit upon his throne of iron. It's a little vague, but it seems to suggest the pharaoh would be traveling to some other dimension far beyond. Perhaps the throne was an advanced device used for transporting matter. In 2017, the Scan Pyramids project uncovered a mysterious void in the Pyramid of Giza. Researchers from Paris and the University of Nagoya in Japan found an unexplainable pocket in the pyramid. Fast forward to 2023, we still don't know what's hiding in the empty space. Some experts are saying it could be the secret location of the meteorite throne, built from pieces of the galaxy. The Greeks in Iceland. It is an irrefutable fact that settlers from Norway arrived in Iceland in the 9th century. The Vikings currently have credit for being the first explorers to settle the island. There have been rumors that Irish monks arrived in Iceland long before that, but those rumors have never been substantiated. Now there is a new theory that the ancient Greeks discovered Iceland over 1,000 years before the Vikings. New research suggests that the Greeks arrived on the island around 300 BC. Andrew Breeze from the University of Navarra says not only did the Greeks reach India during the rule of Alexander the Great, they also discovered Iceland with the explorer Pytheas. But of course, it wasn't called Iceland yet. The Greeks referred to it as Thula, and after its initial find, nobody ever saw it again. The land went from a real place to somewhere mythical, and seeped into the lore of ancient Greece. In the ancient writings of Pytheas, he described embarking upon a voyage across the Atlantic to a mythical land he called Thula. He claimed it took 6 days to reach this land from Britain, and that it was the most northern place ever reached by his people. But the Greeks would have never seen anything like Iceland before. When they first set eyes on the island, they likely would have seen its skies shrouded in smoke and clouds from the active volcanoes. It would have been a hellish landscape of ice and fire, and may have scared the Greeks so effectively they never went back. The Ant People and the Anunnaki. The ancient Native American tribe, the Hopi, told stories of the Ant People. The Hopi described them as the oldest of people, older than any other tribe dwelling on the planet since the beginning of time. There is a striking resemblance between the Ant People of the Hopi and the mysterious Anunnaki of the ancient Sumerians. In Hopi legend, the Ant People possessed great knowledge of all things. They took the Hopi under their wing, so to speak, teaching them how to survive, how to build stronger dwellings out of rock, and how to understand cosmic cycles. They also taught the Hopi the basics of things like mathematics and astronomy. It was thanks to the knowledge of the Ant People that the Hopi were able to prosper and thrive as a highly advanced civilization in North America. The story is nearly identical to the one on the other side of the world. In ancient Mesopotamia, the Sumerians worshipped the Anunnaki. The Sumerians believed the Anunnaki came from the stars with the same wisdom as the Ant People. They taught the Sumerians math, astronomy, physics, and other sciences that helped them advance as a society. Some say the Anunnaki were a race of aliens who came to Earth to mine our resources and enslave humanity, but that might not be the case at all. If these beings were real, as ancient legends from across the world seem to suggest, they may not have had such malicious intent. They may have come from the stars to help all of the early people of the world enter a new era of civilization. Ancient astronaut theorists believe that with the knowledge gifted by these mysterious visitors, people like the Hopi and the Sumerians were able to move beyond Stone Age living and into a more modern age, and this may have been the catalyst for our modern world. What do you think? Outside help, or were just ancient cultures really smart? Big shout out to Coutlaw and Janet Smith. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, be sure to subscribe and join the family. We'd love to have you. The Legend of the Christmas Spider. If you've ever celebrated Christmas before, you've probably decorated a Christmas tree. And if you've decorated a Christmas tree, you've probably used your fair share of tinsel. But did you know tinsel is only a common Christmas tree decoration because of the bizarre tale of the Christmas spider? The legend of the Christmas spider likely originated in Germany or Ukraine several hundred years ago. The legend states that there was once a poor widow living in a small hut with her children. She was a hard-working woman, but hardly had enough to provide for her kids. Then, one year, a pine cone fell on the floor in the middle of their hut, and a pine tree began to grow. The children cared for the tree, hoping it would grow big and strong in time for Christmas. They wanted to decorate the tree, but the widow didn't have enough money. The children went to sleep on Christmas Eve disappointed, but woke in the morning to see the tree decorated in shiny silk webs. During the night, a spider had decorated the tree with its webs. And when the morning light hit those webs, the strands turned into pure silver and gold, and the widow was rich. Ever since, Europeans have been decorating their trees with tinsel. Even though the story of the Christmas spider may sound absurd, you might say the story of Santa and his elves sounds even more unbelievable. What do you think? Do you like the story of the Christmas spider? Let me know in the comments. Elongated skulls, aliens, or elites. For decades now, archaeologists have been discovering mysterious skulls in South America that look like they belong to an entirely different race of beings. These skulls are teardrop-shaped, elongated in the back so that they look like they belong to aliens with gigantic brains. When they first started being found, nobody knew what to think. Most of these skulls are 700 years old or older, and they look like they're from a galaxy far, far away. However, scientists say the elongated Peruvian skulls have nothing to do with aliens. Instead, they represent a distinct ruling class that dominated South America. There are two trains of thought on this. Mainstream scientists say these skulls were the result of cranial deformation. During infancy, the babies of elite people were bound with fabric or wooden boards, forcing the skull to develop tall and thin. The result would have been extremely easy to see. Members of the higher social class could be recognized because of their long skulls. Bioarchaeologist Matthew Velasco from Cornell University says the cranial modifications were used to unite the powerful elite. This likely strengthened inequality and polarization. The other train of thought is that Peru was ruled by aliens. There are those who believe that mainstream scientists are lying. Some say there was a race of highly advanced beings with huge brains living among us, and that they are still among us right now. The legend of the Mexican princess. The legend of the Mexican princess has been around since the days of the Aztec Empire, or rather since the fall of the Aztec Empire. Her name was Malintzin, and she was supposedly born in the early 1500s somewhere in Veracruz, Mexico. She belonged to the indigenous group the Nahuas and was made a slave at a young age. She was a little more than a teenager when she was given as a gift to Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés, shortly after his arrival in 1519. 500 years later, Malintzin is still a mysterious and controversial figure. She's been described as the secret weapon of Cortés, the key piece used in bringing down the Aztec Empire and allowing the Spanish to conquer Mexico. According to the legends, Malintzin used her talents with language to help the Spanish on their way to victory. She warned the conquistadors about the secret ambush planned by Aztec King Moctezuma in Cholula. She helped Cortés secure alliances with Aztec enemies, and she even allegedly converted natives to Catholicism. Some stories say she had a son with Hernán Cortés, the first mixed-race child in Latin America. The Sumerian Airport. The Iraqi transport minister made some bizarre claims recently. Kazem Finjan told the press that the first airport in the world was built in Dakar, Iraq, 7,000 years ago. He went on to claim the Sumerians of Mesopotamia traveled to the planet Pluto using their own spaceships. This would have been before the invention of the wheel. It's a shocking thing to hear, especially coming from an official minister, but it's definitely not the first time such a thing has been suggested. Sumer was one of the first societies that formed on this planet. They were some of the first to settle southern Mesopotamia around 5,500 BC. Once settled, the Sumerians developed agricultural technology. They started to trade with other groups nearby. They practiced artistic skills like weaving and working with pottery. The Sumerians were one of the first truly artistic civilizations, and they also built great cities and monuments from stone. For example, the Ziggurat of Ur, a tiered pyramid that rivaled Khufu's pyramid in Egypt. As for the controversy of the first airport, we don't have any physical proof of it. Sure, there could have been a landing strip in the lands of Sumer used by someone with advanced flying technology. However, all archaeological evidence points to that not being true. As far as science is concerned, the first human being in space was Russian pilot Yuri Gagarin in 1961. But hey, this statement was probably great for publicity. Manipulating DNA. One of the most critical beliefs of the ancient astronaut theorists is that human beings had their DNA manipulated by more advanced life forms. They say a mysterious group, perhaps the Anunnaki, tinkered with our DNA to kickstart human evolution and societal advancement. There is also a belief that ancient cultures knew about the third eye, a very real thing located in the pituitary gland of the brain. The third eye is frequently depicted as a pine cone, since that's what it looks like. It's interesting because pine cones can be found throughout ancient artwork dating back to the height of Mesopotamia. Somehow, ancient people had a deep understanding of these things. But how is the third eye connected to the advanced beings who supposedly manipulated our DNA? That is a very difficult question to answer. The truth is that scientists still don't know what most of our DNA does. Nobody understands what creates consciousness or what kind of energetic influences can change DNA. Some researchers have speculated human DNA could be connected to our spiritual beings. All we really know is that the ancient civilizations understood DNA and spiritual power. Take the Sumerian double helix snake god Istaran as an example, seen in ancient artworks as a depiction of the DNA helix. The earliest Stonehenge. According to Cambridge University, a shocking new discovery has been made involving Stonehenge. Archaeologists uncovered a dismantled stone circle not far from the Bluestone quarries in West Wales. These quarries were the same ones used for mining the stones that make up Stonehenge. What's really interesting is that the dismantled stone circle seems to support the possibility that Stonehenge itself was built from a much earlier stone circle. The radiocarbon dating of the new discovery places it at around 5000 BC. That was right before the initial construction of Stonehenge. The imprints left behind by the moved stones shows the circle was oriented on the midsummer solstice. The suggestion here is that Stonehenge was built using the remnants of an older stone circle, built about 140 miles away. That means a group of prehistoric humans dismantled the stone circle like it was a campsite. Then they carried the multi-ton stones across almost all of Britain, finally rebuilding the circle on Salisbury Plain. Nobody knows why they did this or even how. It's difficult for scientists to come up with a possible motivation for moving Stonehenge, other than the stones were believed to have some magical properties. Some have suggested the stones acted as a stargate, allowing ancient Britons to communicate with beings from space. Thanks for watching! Which of these strange ancient stories did you find the most intriguing? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. See you next time. Bye!